Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We often speak of secrets being buried, but some are carried silent, heavy passenger for a lifetime, waiting only for the final destination to be revealed. What compels a person, in their last moments on earth, to unburden a soul long accustomed to deception? When the fear of earthly judgment is gone, a different kind of reckoning can emerge. This is the power of the deathbed revelation, a final, whispered truth that can shatter decades of silence, solve an impossible cold case, and reshape a family's history. Tonight, we examine one such story. This is the final confession. Case 1. The Monster's Final Word. A notorious serial killer's deathbed claim solves a nation's most famous child abduction. Our first story begins on a day that should have been utterly unremarkable. The humid Florida air of July 27, 1981, was thick with the banal promises of a summer afternoon. For Reve Walsh and her 6-year-old son, Adam, it was a day for errands. Adam was a boy with a bright, trusting smile and a cap of sandy blonde hair, a child who embodied the very essence of American innocence. His father, John Walsh, was a successful hotel developer, and together, they were the picture of a happy, thriving young family living a comfortable life in the sun-drenched community of Hollywood, Florida. Their final stop that day was the Sears department store at the Hollywood Mall. Reve needed to pick up some lamps. Adam, like any boy his age, was drawn to the flickering lights and electronic sounds of the video game department. While his mother went to the lamp section just a few aisles away, Adam joined a group of other boys gathered around a demonstration model of an Atari 2600. It was a scene playing out in thousands of stores across the country. A mother gives her son a small measure of independence, keeping him within earshot, promising to be back in just a moment. In Reve's mind, the minutes stretched into an elastic, terrifying eternity. When she returned to the toy department, the other boys were still there. But Adam was gone. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It began as a flutter in Reve's chest, a quick scan of the nearby aisles. Then it grew, a frantic calling of his name, her voice rising with each unanswered cry. She enlisted store employees. A Code Adam did not yet exist. That protocol would be born from this very day's tragedy. Instead, a garbled, almost casual announcement was made over the store's public address system. Adam Walsh, please come to customer service. The minutes bled into an hour. The store was searched. The parking lot was scoured. But Adam had vanished as if into thin air. The Hollywood Police Department was called, but in 1981, the response to a missing child was tragically different from what it is today. There was no Amber Alert system, no immediate, large-scale mobilization. The prevailing belief was that most missing children were not abducted by strangers, but were simply lost or had run away. They treated the disappearance not as a probable kidnapping, but as a missing person case. This fundamental misunderstanding would have catastrophic consequences for the investigation. The days that followed were a blur of media attention and agonizing, fruitless searching. John and Reve Walsh plastered their son's face on milk cartons and billboards, a pioneering act that would later become a national standard. They held desperate press conferences, their faces etched with a grief that was raw and public. The story of the missing boy with the unforgettable smile captured the nation's heart. It was a parent's worst nightmare, broadcast into every living room. The Walsh's private agony became a national obsession, a symbol of a creeping fear that the world was not as safe as it had seemed. For 2 agonizing weeks, there was a sliver of hope. Perhaps he had been taken by someone who wanted a child. Perhaps he was still alive. That hope was brutally extinguished on August 10, 1981. 2 fishermen in a canal, more than 120 miles north in rural Indian River County, made a gruesome discovery. It was Adam Walsh's severed head. The rest of his body was never found. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. The national search for a missing boy had become a homicide investigation. The investigation that followed was a textbook example of systemic failure, a tragedy compounded by incompetence. Leads were mishandled, evidence was lost, and a prime suspect was identified and then dismissed in a series of blunders that would haunt law enforcement for decades. The police were overwhelmed, unequipped to handle a crime of this magnitude. They pursued thousands of tips, many of them dead ends. They briefly considered Jeffrey Dahmer, who was living in Miami at the time, but ruled him out. They were drowning in information but starving for facts. Then, in October 1983, more than 2 years after Adam's murder, a breakthrough seemed to arrive from the unlikeliest of sources. A man named Otis Toole, a drifter and convicted arsonist already in custody in Jacksonville, Florida, for unrelated crimes, began to confess. Toole was a chilling figure, a man of low intelligence, but possessing a feral cunning. He was a known associate of the even more infamous serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, and together they had cut a bloody swath across the country. They were members of a self-proclaimed hand of death cult, their lives a litany of arson, robbery, and murder. When questioned about other crimes, Toole began to speak about a little boy in a Hollywood mall. His confession was chillingly detailed. He told investigators that he had been in the Hollywood Mall that day and had lured a young boy from the store with promises of candy and toys. He described Adam perfectly. He said he drove Adam north on the Florida Turnpike, and when the boy began to cry and panic, Toole lost his temper. He described a struggle, a panic, and the single, horrific act of decapitation with a machete he kept in the car. He knew details that had never been released to the public, details that only the killer could know. He led police to the general area where he claimed to have disposed of the body, though a search yielded nothing. It seemed for a moment that the case was solved. The monster had a name, Otis Toole. But then, just as quickly, the case fell apart. Toole recanted his confession. This was his pattern, a sick game he played with law enforcement. He would confess to heinous crimes, basking in the attention and the power it gave him, and then he would take it all back, delighting in the confusion and frustration he caused. He was a pathological liar, a spinner of tales so dark and numerous that it became impossible for investigators to separate fact from fiction. The Hollywood Police Department, in a decision that would later be condemned as a colossal failure, fumbled the case against him. They lost the blood-stained carpet samples taken from Toole's 1971 Cadillac, a crucial piece of forensic evidence that could have placed Adam in the car. They even lost the official homicide file for a time. Faced with Toole's recantation and their own lack of corroborating physical evidence, they concluded they could not build a prosecutable case. They officially dropped Otis Toole as their prime suspect. For the Walsh family, it was a devastating blow. The closure they so desperately needed was snatched away, leaving them in a limbo of uncertainty that would last for another quarter of a century. John Walsh's grief, however, did not curdle into despair. It was forged into a weapon. He transformed himself from a grieving father into the nation's most prominent advocate for victims' rights. He and Reve founded the Adam Walsh Child Resource Center, which later became the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. John Walsh became the host of America's Most Wanted, a television show that revolutionized the relationship between law enforcement and the public, leading to the capture of over 1,000 fugitives. He dedicated his life to ensuring that what happened to his son, and the botched investigation that followed, would never happen to another family. The name Adam Walsh became synonymous not just with tragedy, but with a movement that changed the laws of the land and the way we protect our children. Meanwhile, Otis Toole continued his life behind bars, a footnote in the Adam Walsh case, a person of interest who was never charged. He was convicted on 2 other murder charges and multiple counts of arson, sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair, a sentence later commuted to life in prison. He would occasionally revive his confession to Adam's murder when it suited him, usually to a fellow inmate or a tabloid reporter, only to recant it again. He toyed with the truth, keeping the wound of the Walsh family perpetually open. He seemed to enjoy the infamy, the power he held over this iconic American tragedy. Years turned into decades. The case grew colder, a national mystery with a famous face but no resolution. John Walsh, in public, was a crusader. In private, he and his family lived with the gnawing uncertainty. They believed Toole was the killer, but the official record did not reflect it. The final chapter of the story begins in a prison infirmary. In September 1996, Otis Toole was 49 years old and dying of cirrhosis of the liver. The years of hard living and prison life had caught up with him. He was jaundiced, weak, a shadow of the swaggering monster who had once claimed to be part of a satanic killing cult. In his final days, he was visited by his niece, a woman to whom he had always been close. He knew the end was near. The games were over. There were no more deals to be made, no more attention to be gained. There was only the quiet, sterile room and the prospect of his own mortality. Looking at his niece, with what little strength he had left, he spoke about Adam Walsh one last time. This was not a confession to the police. It was not for a reporter. It was a final, quiet admission. He told her in no uncertain terms that he had abducted and murdered the boy. He repeated the details he had first given in 1983: the mall, the car, the machete. He expressed a flicker of what his niece interpreted as remorse, a final need to unburden his soul before he met his maker. He had nothing to gain from this confession. It was the truth, offered up at the very edge of the grave. A few days later, on September 15, 1996, Otis Toole died. He was cremated, and his remains went unclaimed. The monster was gone, but his secret was now in the hands of his family. His niece relayed the deathbed confession to John Walsh. For John, it was the confirmation he had always known in his heart, but it was still not an official resolution. The Hollywood Police Department, despite this powerful new testimony, remained hesitant. Toole was dead. He could not be prosecuted. The case file remained open. It would take another 12 years and a change in leadership at the department for the final act to play out. In 2008, the newly appointed chief of police in Hollywood, Florida, Chad Wagner, took a fresh look at the dormant case. He reviewed the old files, the lost evidence, the original 1983 confession, and the subsequent deathbed revelation. He concluded that the circumstantial evidence against Toole was overwhelming. He believed the original investigators had made a terrible mistake in dismissing him as a suspect. He felt a moral obligation to finally give the Walsh family the answer they had been denied for so long. On December 16, 2008, 27 years after Adam disappeared from that Sears department store, Chief Wagner held a press conference. With a visibly emotional John and Reve Walsh by his side, he announced that the Hollywood Police Department was officially closing the case of Adam Walsh. The killer, he declared, was Otis Toole. "We have a victim, we have a confessed killer, and we have a family that has suffered for way too long," Wagner said. There would be no trial, no conviction, but there was, at last, a definitive answer. For John Walsh, the moment was the culmination of a lifetime of fighting. He told the assembled reporters, "The waiting, the not knowing, is a torture. But that journey is over." The final confession of a dying monster, whispered in a prison infirmary, had finally traveled through the years to bring a semblance of peace to America's most famous grieving father. The story of Adam Walsh is a searing chronicle of the loss of a child, the loss of a nation's innocence, and the loss of faith in the systems designed to protect us. But it is also a story of transformation, of how a family's unimaginable pain was channeled into a force for profound and lasting change. The deathbed revelation of Otis Toole was not a gift of redemption, for a soul so dark is beyond such things. It was, instead, a final, involuntary surrender of a truth he could no longer carry, a final word that, while it could never heal the wound, could finally close the book on a question that had haunted a family and a nation for decades. Case 2. The Veterans Buried War. A daughter's promise to her dying father reveals his 40-year-old secret. Our second story takes us to the stark, windswept landscapes of western South Dakota, a place of rugged beauty and deep-seated secrets. It is a land where towns are small and memories are long, where the prairie whispers tales of the past to those who know how to listen. This is a story not of a monstrous drifter, but of a seemingly ordinary man, a husband, a father, a veteran who carried a secret as vast and empty as the plains he called home. It is a story about how a daughter's final promise to her dying father would unearth a truth buried for nearly half a century, solving a cold case that had long been given up for dead. The year was 1974. In the small, close-knit town of Remsen, Iowa, Pam and Chester Neiman were raising their 2 young children. They were a typical Midwestern family, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the simple joys of small-town life. But their peace was about to be shattered. In the early morning hours of September 12, 1974, a masked intruder broke into their home. The man, armed with a gun, tied up Chester Neiman. He then dragged Pam from her bed and sexually assaulted her. The children, a boy and a girl, were awakened by their mother's screams. In the chaos and terror of the moment, the intruder shot and killed the family dog before fleeing into the pre-dawn darkness. The crime sent a shockwave through the quiet community of Remsen. It was a violation of the town's most fundamental sense of safety. The police investigation was intense, but it quickly hit a wall. Pam Neiman, traumatized and having seen her attacker only briefly in the dark, could provide only a vague description. There was little physical evidence left at the scene. The leads dried up, and the case went cold, leaving the Neiman family to live with the aftermath of a trauma that had no resolution. The masked man was a ghost, a nameless specter who had visited upon them a night of unimaginable horror and then vanished without a trace. Life moved on as it must. The Neimans eventually moved away from Remsen, seeking to leave the ghosts of that night behind them. The case file gathered dust on a shelf in the Plymouth County Sheriff's Office, one of a handful of unsolved crimes that haunted the careers of the detectives who had worked it. The years turned into decades. Children grew up, investigators retired, and the memory of the home invasion faded from the public consciousness, becoming a piece of local lore, a dark tale whispered about a generation ago. Now we shift our focus forward in time and westward in geography, to South Dakota. It is here we meet a man named Frank L. Van Houten. To his neighbors and family, Frank was a solid, if somewhat solitary, figure. He was a veteran who had served in the military, a man who worked hard to provide for his wife and children. He was quiet, reserved, a man who kept to himself. Like many veterans of his era, he carried the burdens of his past silently. His daughter, Maureen, knew him as a loving but distant father, a man with a deep well of sadness behind his eyes that she could never quite understand. In 2011, Frank Van Houten was 70 years old, and his health was failing. Years of hard living had taken their toll. As he lay dying, He called his daughter Maureen to his bedside. He knew his time was short, and there was something he needed to do, a weight he needed to lift before he passed. He made his daughter promise him something. He told her that after he was gone, she was to call a specific police department in a state far away. He gave her a name to ask for and a crime to mention. He was cryptic, not offering a full confession, but planting a seed. He was entrusting her with the key to a secret he had carried for a lifetime. He made her promise she would make the call. It was his final wish. Maureen, bewildered and grieving, agreed. A few days later, Frank Van Houten died. True to her word, and burdened by a curiosity she could no longer contain, Maureen picked up the phone. She dialed the number for the Sioux Falls Police Department in South Dakota. She explained what her father had told her, that he had information about a crime. The officer on the other end of the line was initially confused. The crime her father had mentioned hadn't happened in Sioux Falls. Through a series of follow-up calls and interagency communications, the information was finally routed to the correct jurisdiction, hundreds of miles away, the Plymouth County Sheriff's Office in Le Mars, Iowa. When the call finally reached Plymouth County, it landed on the desk of a detective who recognized the names and the year. The Remsen home invasion of 1974. The coldest of cold cases. A file that hadn't been touched in years. Suddenly, a ghost from the past had a name. Frank Van Houten. The deathbed directive from a dying father to his daughter had breathed new life into a 37-year-old mystery. Investigators reopened the file. They learned that back in 1974, Frank Van Houten had lived in Akron, Iowa, a town just a short drive from Remsen. He fit the general time and place. This was more than a coincidence, it was a tangible lead. The problem, however, was that the primary suspect was dead. A confession from beyond the grave, relayed by a third party, was powerful, but it wasn't enough to officially close the case. They needed proof. They needed something to connect Frank Van Houten directly to the crime scene. The original case file from 1974 was pulled from the archives. The investigators combed through the yellowed pages, the typewritten reports, the lists of dead-end leads. And then they found it. Tucked away in an evidence envelope was a small, seemingly insignificant item that had been collected from the Neiman's bedroom that night. A single, black and white plaid glove. The intruder had dropped it during the struggle. In 1974, DNA technology was the stuff of science fiction. The glove was just a glove. But in 2011, it was a potential time capsule, a repository of genetic information waiting for the right technology to unlock its secrets. The investigators had a plan. They needed a DNA sample from Frank Van Houten to compare against any potential DNA found on the glove. Since he was deceased and had been cremated, they turned to his family. They approached his daughter, Maureen, the woman who had set this entire chain of events in motion. They explained the situation. Maureen, still grappling with the revelation of her father's dark secret, agreed to cooperate fully. She provided a DNA sample. Under the laws of genetics, her DNA would share enough markers with her father's to establish a familial link to any DNA he may have left behind. The glove was sent to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations Crime Lab. Forensic scientists carefully examined the nearly 40-year-old piece of evidence. They swabbed the interior, hoping that skin cells from the wearer might have survived the decades. The result was more than they could have hoped for. The lab was able to isolate a partial DNA profile from the inside of the glove. It was a fragile, incomplete sample, but it was there. The next step was the comparison. The lab technicians took the DNA profile from the glove and compared it to the DNA sample provided by Maureen Van Houten. The results were conclusive. The DNA found inside the glove was a familial match to Maureen's. The probability that the DNA belonged to a man who was her biological father was astronomically high. The science had confirmed the secret. Frank Van Houten, the quiet veteran, the loving father, had been in Pam Neiman's bedroom on that terrifying night in 1974. The ghost had a face. In January 2012, nearly 38 years after the crime, the Plymouth County Sheriff held a press conference. He announced that the 1974 home invasion and sexual assault case was officially closed. The perpetrator, he stated, was Frank L. Van Houten. The evidence was irrefutable, a deathbed confession corroborated by a DNA match from a piece of evidence that had been waiting patiently for 4 decades. For Pam and Chester Neiman, the news was a bombshell. After living for nearly 4 decades with the unanswered trauma, they finally had a name. The resolution brought a complex mix of emotions: relief that the mystery was solved, renewed pain as old wounds were reopened, and a profound sense of shock. The man who had terrorized them was not some mythical monster, but a man who had lived a seemingly normal life just a town away, a man who had raised a family of his own. The confession of Frank Van Houten leaves behind a trail of unanswered questions that follow him to the grave. What was his motive? Was this a planned attack, or a crime of opportunity? Did he know the Neimans? And, perhaps most hauntingly, was this the only secret he carried? Was he responsible for other unsolved crimes, other nights of terror that remained shrouded in mystery? These are questions we will never be able to answer. His final confession was specific to this one act, a single entry in a ledger that may have contained many more. The story of Frank Van Houten is a powerful testament to the enduring weight of guilt. It demonstrates that a secret, no matter how deeply buried, can fester in the soul, demanding release. For nearly 40 years, Van Houten carried the knowledge of his crime, a private, internal war that ran parallel to his outward life as a husband and father. He managed to evade the law, but he could not evade his own conscience. In the end, faced with his own mortality, the need to confess, to unburden himself even in a cryptic, second-hand way, became overwhelming. It is also a story about a daughter's promise. Maureen Van Houten was given a terrible inheritance, the knowledge of her father's monstrous secret. In fulfilling his final wish, she chose truth over silence, bringing a painful but necessary resolution to another family's lifelong trauma. Her courage in the face of a devastating revelation is a quiet but powerful counterpoint to her father's crime. Frank Van Houten's final words were not a plea for forgiveness, but an act of pointing. He pointed investigators toward a truth he could no longer bear to hold alone. He provided the final puzzle piece to a mystery that had long been abandoned, a last gasp act of confession that, while it could never undo the horror of his actions, finally allowed justice, in its own belated and incomplete way, to be served. It is a chilling reminder that the quietest men can carry the loudest secrets, and that sometimes the dead do tell tales. Case 3. The Keeper of the Secret. A dying woman's confession implicates her ex-husband in a 50-year-old disappearance. Our third story takes us to the heart of the American Midwest, to Decatur, Illinois. This is a city built on agriculture and industry, a place of smokestacks and silos rising from the flat, fertile plains of the Prairie State. In the summer of 1962, Decatur was a place operating under the familiar veneer of post-war tranquility. Life was predictable, communities were close, and the most sinister threats seemed to be the stuff of faraway places. It was in this seemingly safe and ordinary setting that a man would vanish, leaving behind a silence that would last for more than half a century, a silence kept under lock and key in the terrified heart of one woman. The man who disappeared was named Paul B. Whipke. At 78 years old, He was a fixture in his Decatur neighborhood, a man whose life was etched with the lines of American history. He was a veteran of the First World War, a widower, and a small-time landlord who managed a few properties around the city. He was known to be a kind, if somewhat frugal, man, a creature of habit who lived a quiet life with his beloved dog. Like many of his generation who had lived through the Great Depression, he was distrustful of banks and was known to carry significant amounts of cash on his person. It was a habit born of caution, but one that rendered him tragically vulnerable. On July 11, 1962, Paul Whipkey collected rent money from his tenants, a routine task. He was seen around town, running his errands. And then he was not. He failed to show up for a planned family dinner. Calls to his home went unanswered. When a family member went to check on him, they found a scene that was not one of violence, but of an unsettling stillness. The front door was unlocked. Inside, his dog was waiting unfed. On a table sat his hearing aid and his false teeth, items a man would never voluntarily leave behind. Of Paul Whipkey and the rent money he had collected, there was no sign. The Decatur Police Department launched a missing persons investigation. A few days later, they found Whipkey's car, a 1951 green Plymouth, parked at the Decatur airport. The discovery only deepened the mystery. There was no record of him buying a ticket or boarding a flight. The car seemed to have been abandoned there, a deliberate red herring designed to suggest he had simply left town. But the evidence at his home, the dog, the hearing aid, the teeth, screamed a different story. This was not a man who had left. This was a man who had been taken. Detectives suspected foul play, likely a robbery gone wrong. They interviewed tenants, friends, and family. They chased down leads, but every path led to a dead end. There was no body, no crime scene, no witnesses to a struggle. The case was a frustrating void, an investigation built around an absence. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case of Paul B. Whipkey went cold. His name was added to a sorrowful ledger of the permanently missing. He became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale, his disappearance an unsolved riddle that the city of Decatur slowly, inevitably, began to forget. Now, let us introduce the keepers of the secret. Donald W. Shore Sr. was a younger man who had, at one time, worked for Paul Whipkey as a handyman. He was known to have a fierce temper, especially when he drank. He was married to a woman named Mary, and their life together was tumultuous, punctuated by Donald's volatility and Mary Ann's quiet endurance. They lived a working-class life, always seeming to struggle for money. They were on the periphery of the Whipkey investigation, just one of many people who knew the old man, but they were never considered prime suspects. There was simply no evidence to link them to the crime. For 51 years, the secret lay dormant. Donald and Mary Ann eventually divorced. Donald Shore Sr. lived out the rest of his life and died in 1987, taking, it seemed, any knowledge he had to the grave. Mary Ann remarried and moved on, living a quiet life, her past locked away in a part of her memory she never spoke of. The secret she kept was a perfect one, buried under 5 decades of silence. It was a weight she carried alone, a silent, daily act of complicity born of terror. She knew where Paul Whipkey was. She had been there. The final act of this long, silent tragedy begins in 2013. Mary Ann Shore, now in her late 70s, was in a nursing home, dying of cancer. The decades of silence had taken their toll, carving their own lines of sorrow into her face. As her body weakened, the walls she had built around her secret for a lifetime began to crumble. The fear of her ex-husband, a fear that had outlived the man himself, was finally being eclipsed by a different kind of reckoning. She knew she was facing the end, and she could not bear to take her secret with her. She needed to tell someone. She needed the truth to finally see the light of day. She confided in her daughter, Deanna. In a series of conversations, whispered in the sterile quiet of the nursing home room, the story of what happened on that July day in 1962 poured out of her. It was a confession delivered in halting breaths, a 51-year-old horror story finally given a voice. Mary Ann told her daughter that on that day, Donald Shore had gone to Paul Whipke's house. The motive was simple and brutal: robbery. Donald knew Whipke had just collected the rent and would be carrying cash. An argument broke out. Donald, in a fit of rage, forced the old man into the basement. Mary Ann was there. She witnessed the entire thing, a spectator to a nightmare. In the dim light of the cellar, Donald picked up a crowbar. He beat the 78-year-old veteran to death. The confession continued, a step-by-step recitation of the cover-up. Mary Ann described how she and Donald wrapped Paul Whipke's body in a blanket. They loaded him into the trunk of their car, a dead weight that carried the gravity of their crime. Then, under the cover of darkness, they drove out of the city, into the countryside, to a farm owned by Donald's sister. On the property was an old, abandoned well. They pushed Paul Whipke's body into the dark, earthen shaft and covered it over. They had buried him where they believed no one would ever think to look. Mary Ann then recounted how Donald had driven Whipke's car to the airport to create the false trail that had so successfully stumped investigators half a century earlier. For Deanna, her mother's confession was a cataclysm. It was the answer to a local mystery, but it was also a revelation that her father was a murderer and her mother had been his silent accomplice. The secret, once her mother's burden, was now hers. She was faced with a terrible choice: protect her family's dark past or provide justice for a man who had been denied it for half a century. She chose justice. Deanna went to the Macon County Sheriff's Office. She told them the incredible story her dying mother had just revealed. The detectives were stunned. It was a lead from a ghost, a voice from 1962 speaking through the lips of a dying woman in 2013. Despite the incredible nature of the story, they took it seriously. They began to corroborate the details. They located the farm that had once belonged to Donald Shore's sister. The property had changed hands over the years, but the old well was still there, a forgotten feature of the landscape. In October 2013, the Macon County Sheriff's Office, along with forensic anthropologists from the University of Illinois, arrived at the farm. They brought in an excavator and began the delicate, painstaking process of digging up the old well. It was a search for a ghost, guided by a 51-year-old map drawn from a dying woman's memory. As the excavator clawed away at the earth, the team sifted through the dirt. First they found animal bones. Then they found a button. Then a shoe. And then human bones. They had found him. The skeleton was largely intact, still tangled in the tattered remains of a blanket. They had unearthed a 51-year-old tomb. The remains were sent for analysis. Dental records confirmed what Mary Ann's confession had promised. They were the remains of Paul B. Whipke. After 51 years, the missing man had been found. An autopsy of the skull revealed multiple fractures, evidence of extreme blunt force trauma, perfectly consistent with Mary Ann's story of a brutal beating with a crowbar. The science had confirmed the secret. The case, for 5 decades of frustrating mystery, was now solved. A few weeks after the discovery, Mary Ann Shore died, her conscience finally, perhaps a little lighter. Her ex-husband, Donald, the killer, had been dead for 26 years, forever beyond the reach of earthly justice. In November 2013, the Macon County Sheriff officially closed the murder case of Paul B. Whipke. The story of Mary and Shore is a profound illustration of the corrosive power of secrets and the paralyzing nature of fear. For 51 years, she lived a double life, her present haunted by the ever-present specter of her past. She was a captive of her own memory, a prisoner of a secret she was too terrified to reveal while its architect was still alive, and perhaps even after he was gone. Her confession was not offered in a plea for leniency or as a bargaining chip. It was a pure, final unburdening. It was the act of a woman who, at the end of her life, chose to let the truth out, no matter the cost to her own legacy or her family's name. It raises a question as old as morality itself. Does silence in the face of evil constitute a partnership with it? Was Mary and Shore a victim, trapped in a violent relationship and coerced into silence by a monstrous man? Or was she an accomplice who, by her inaction, allowed a murderer to escape justice for his entire life? The law may have seen her as an accessory after the fact, but her own fear may have been a prison more real than any built of steel and stone. Her final confession was a key, turning the lock on a cold case that had been sealed for generations. It allowed a family, long denied answers, to finally bring their loved one home and give him a proper burial. It was a final, whispered revelation that proved that even after 51 years, the truth, once buried, can be resurrected, and that the quietest confession from the edge of the grave can echo with the undeniable power of justice. Case 4. The Ghoul's Accomplice. A deathbed claim suggests the infamous Butcher of Plainfield did not act alone. For our final story, we descend into one of the most grotesque and unsettling chapters in the annals of American crime. We travel to the isolated, frozen farmlands of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place that, in 1957, became the unwilling epicenter of a real-life horror story that would inspire cinematic monsters like Norman Bates from Psycho and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is the story of Ed Gein, the so-called Butcher of Plainfield, or Plainfield Ghoul. But this is not simply a retelling of his well-known atrocities. It is an exploration of a chilling possibility, a deathbed claim that suggests this famously solitary monster may not have been so solitary after all. Edward Theodore Gein was a product of his environment, a man shaped by isolation, religious fanaticism, and a profoundly twisted relationship with his mother, Augusta. After his father and brother died, Ed and Augusta lived alone on their dilapidated 160-acre farm, cut off from the rest of the world. Augusta was a domineering, puritanical woman who preached to her son about the innate immorality of the world, particularly of women. She was his only companion, his only source of truth. When she died in 1945, Ed Gein, then in his late 30s, was left completely and utterly alone, a man-child adrift in a world his mother had taught him to despise, his mind an unholy shrine to her memory. The silence of the farmhouse became a workshop for his madness. In an attempt to resurrect his mother, or perhaps to become her, Gein began a series of nocturnal activities that would cement his place in the darkest corners of criminal history. He started reading obituary columns, noting the recent burials of middle-aged women who he felt resembled his mother. Under the cover of darkness, he would visit local cemeteries, unearthing the freshly buried corpses. He would dismember the bodies, taking home the parts that interested him: head, skin, bones. His farmhouse, which had been sealed off from the outside world since Augusta's death, became a charnel house, a museum of human remains. The full inventory of its contents is the stuff of nightmares: bowls made from human skulls, chairs upholstered with human skin, a corset fashioned from a female torso, leggings made from the skin of human legs, and masks created from the faces of dead women. He had created a world for himself out of the dead, a grotesque domesticity built from the desecrated remains of others. For years, Gaines' activities were limited to grave robbing. He was a ghoul, a scavenger of the dead. But at some point, a line was crossed. The need for fresh materials, or perhaps a deeper, more violent urge, led him from scavenging to hunting. His first confirmed victim was Mary Hogan, the 54-year-old owner of a local tavern. In December 1954, she vanished from her bar. A pool of blood on the floor and a spent .32 caliber cartridge were the only clues. She was gone. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Bernice Wardens, the 58-year-old owner of the Plainfield hardware store, also disappeared. Her son, Frank, was a deputy sheriff. He told investigators that the last customer in the store before his mother vanished was the strange and reclusive farmer, Ed Gain, who had come in to buy a gallon of antifreeze. It was the only lead they had. That evening, investigators drove out to the Gain farm. The property was dark, neglected, exuding an air of profound decay. When they entered the farmhouse, they stepped into a scene of unimaginable horror. They found Bernice Warden's body. She had been decapitated and hung upside down from the rafters, dressed out like a deer. Her head was found in a burlap sack. The subsequent search of the house revealed the full, shocking extent of Gaines' macabre collection. The butcher of Plainfield had been unmasked. Gain was arrested that night. He was quiet, cooperative, almost docile. He confessed immediately to killing both Bernice Wardens and Mary Hogan. When questioned about the human remains that littered his home, he calmly explained his grave-robbing expeditions, detailing his trips to at least 3 local cemeteries. He claimed he acted alone in all of it. He was a solitary creature, a man who lived and operated entirely within the sealed-off world of his own psychosis. This narrative that of the lone, mad killer was universally accepted by law enforcement and the public. It was, in its own horrific way, a simple explanation for an incomprehensible set of facts. Gain was found legally insane, or not guilty by reason of insanity, and committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. His house of horrors was scheduled to be auctioned off, but days before the sale, it mysteriously burned to the ground, likely the work of arson by locals who wanted to erase the stain on their community. Ed Gain would spend the rest of his life in mental institutions, dying of respiratory failure in 1984. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, in the family plot, just a few feet from the empty graves he had once plundered. The story, it seemed, was over. But decades later, a final, unsettling chapter would be written, one that challenges the core assumption of the entire case. This final chapter centers on a man named Elmo U.S. Sun. In the 1950s, Sun was a small-time criminal, a man known for his violent temper and his involvement in various illegal schemes. He was also, for a time, a neighbor and acquaintance of Ed Gain. The two men were known to be friends, an odd pairing of the reclusive farmer and the boisterous local hoodlum. Elmo Sun's life was a litany of crime and incarceration. He was in and out of jail for decades. As he aged, his health began to fail. In the year 2000, he was an old man living in a care facility, his body riddled with cancer. He knew he was dying, and like so many of the subjects of our stories, he felt the need to confess, to unburden himself of a secret he had carried for more than 40 years. He began to talk to his nurses and to his caseworker, a woman named Judith A. Shedd. He told them a story that, if true, would rewrite the history of one of America's most infamous killers. Elmo Sun claimed that he had been an active participant in Ed Gain's crimes. This was not a vague boast. It was a series of specific, detailed claims. He said that he and Gain were not just friends, They were partners in crime. He claimed to have accompanied Gain on his grave-robbing expeditions, helping him dig up the bodies. But his confession went even further. He didn't just claim to be an accomplice in the grave robbing, he claimed to be an accomplice in murder. He told Shed that he was with Gain when Mary Hogan was killed. He even claimed that he, not Gain, was the one who pulled the trigger, shooting her in the head. He went on to make an even more shocking claim, that he and Gain were responsible for the deaths of at least 2 other men, 2 hunters who had gone missing in the area years earlier and were never found. He claimed they had killed them and buried their bodies on the Gain property. He was, in his telling, not just a helper, but a co-conspirator and a killer in his own right, perhaps even more violent and calculating than the master himself. Shed, the caseworker, was stunned. She documented her conversations with Sun, preserving his deathbed claims. Was this the rambling of a dying, attention-seeking old man, a final attempt to attach his own insignificant name to a legendarily infamous one? Or was it the truth, a final confession from the ghoul's accomplice? There are details that lend a troubling credibility to Sun's story. He and Gain were, verifiably, friends during that period. Sun's known violent temperament and criminal history make his participation plausible. Furthermore, the official narrative of Ed Gain has always contained nagging inconsistencies. Gain was a small, physically unimposing man. The logistics of unearthing and transporting multiple heavy, cumbersome corpses by himself seems, to some, a daunting, if not impossible, task. The idea of an accomplice, a stronger, more physically capable partner, would solve some of these logistical puzzles. Moreover, the disappearance of the 2 hunters Sun mentioned was a real, unsolved case from that era. Their vanishing had never been explained. Sun's claim that their bodies were buried on the Gain farm offered a potential solution to another cold case, one that had never been linked to Gain. After Gain's arrest, the property was never subjected to the kind of thorough, systematic excavation that might have revealed other bodies. The focus was on the house itself, and after it burned, the site was largely abandoned. It is entirely possible that other secrets remain buried in that Wisconsin soil. Elmo's son died shortly after making his confession, leaving behind a historical grenade. His claims have never been officially substantiated. Without a body, without corroborating physical evidence, and with all the primary parties deceased, his story remains in a gray area of historical speculation. It is a deathbed confession that cannot be proven, but also cannot be easily dismissed. It forces us to re-examine the legend of Ed Gain. Our cultural image of him is that of the ultimate loner, a man so isolated by his madness that he was completely detached from human society. Sun's confession shatters that image. It suggests that Gain may have had a partner, a friend, a confidant in his depravity. This possibility is, in some ways, even more terrifying than the original story. The idea of a lone madman is frightening, but it is contained. The idea of a shared madness, a partnership in necrophilia and murder, suggests a contagion, a darkness that can be shared and amplified between 2 people. Was Elmo's son telling the truth? Was he the forgotten partner in one of America's most horrifying crime sprees? Or was he simply a liar, making a final, desperate grab for a legacy, however dark? We will almost certainly never know for sure. His deathbed confession hangs in the air, a permanent question mark appended to the Ed Gain story. It serves as a powerful reminder that history is not always a settled matter. It is a narrative constructed from the facts we have at hand. And sometimes, a single voice from the edge of the grave is all it takes to suggest that the story we thought we knew is not the whole story at all, and that, even in the most infamous of cases, the deepest secrets may have been kept by someone other than the monster himself. Tonight, we have listened to whispers from the edge of oblivion. We've heard the final words of a dying serial killer, a quiet veteran, a terrified ex-wife, and a possible accomplice to a ghoul. Each confession, a key turning the lock on a mystery that time had all but cemented shut. These stories illuminate the immense, crushing weight of guilt and the profound human need, in the final analysis, for the truth to be known. A secret can be carried for a lifetime, but it seems that for some, it cannot be carried into eternity. These revelations do not offer neat or happy endings. They bring answers, but they also bring fresh pain, reopening wounds for families who had learned to live with the scar of the unknown. They remind us that justice, when it arrives decades late, is an imperfect and bittersweet thing. The dead receive a name for their headstone, but the living are left to grapple with a truth more terrible than the lingering mystery ever was. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio as we explored the power of the final confession. Sleep well, and perhaps listen for the secrets the silence may hold.